In this nugget, you and I get to take a look at how we can organize resources inside of vCenter as well as integrate ESXi hosts that can then be managed using the vSphere web client along with vCenter. Let's begin. I'd like to ask you a question. What is the purpose for having a vCenter server in our vSphere enterprise? And if you're saying, well, Keith, we talked about the vCenter server as a centralized management tool to manage all of our ESXi hosts, you'd be absolutely correct. And that's a lot better than trying to manage each and every one of our individual ESXi hosts alone using the Windows client. With the vCenter server and the vSphere web client, it's a lot easier to do effective enterprise management. Now, the challenge is that the vCenter server all by itself does not know which ESXi hosts, if any, it should be managing and taking care of. So the solution to that is we are going to go ahead and link up ESXi hosts with the vCenter server. So we'll log into the vCenter server, and then using the vSphere web client, we'll tell vCenter server that it's going to go ahead and manage this ESXi host, and this ESXi host, and that one. And in that process, we'll also be supplying the credentials that this vCenter server should use as it connects to and initiates that communication with each of those ESXi hosts. One of the core elements that we're going to use inside of our vCenter server for the organization and the management of our ESXi hosts is called a data center object. You can kind of think of it like a container. So at a bare minimum inside of vCenter, we're going to create at least one logical data center object, and then we can place the ESXi host that we want to into that data center container object. However, many companies have multiple data centers. So we also have the ability for the benefit of organization and also for the assignment of rights and privileges inside of vSphere to use folders. So for example, as part of our vCenter server architecture, we could use some folders. For example, maybe we have one for USA, maybe we have one for Europe. And as I write this, I realize, well, USA is like a country and Europe is like a whole bunch of countries. In any event, those could be top level folders. And then within each of those folders, we can go ahead and create logical data centers. For example, if we have a data center in Las Vegas and we have another one in Reno, we could create individual data centers in that USA folder. And then within the data center, we might have lots of ESXi hosts. So for example, let's take these three right here. We have ESXi host A, B, and C. Let's say they're all in the USA. They're all part of the Las Vegas data center. If we want these ESXi hosts to work together as a team, for example, they're all chipping in their resources regarding CPU and memory. And if we want that, and we want these devices to act and work like a pool of resources that we can use, we can create another object called a cluster. And then we can put those ESXi hosts into that same exact cluster. And then as a result of these three ESXi hosts all being in the same cluster inside the data center, we have a whole bunch of really cool benefits. Let me give you an example of one of them. Let's say that each of these ESXi hosts has 4 virtual machines that are running. And let's say each of those virtual machines are using approximately 10% of the CPU of their host. So as an example, let's imagine that each of these ESXi hosts is at 40% utilization regarding, let's say, CPU utilization. So they're all at 40%. And then, all of a sudden, this virtual machine, it goes crazy. Let's say it takes up 70%. So now, ESXi host A is at 100% utilization regarding CPU. When these three ESXi hosts are in the same cluster, and we've enabled a feature called Distributed Resource Scheduler, vSphere, with specifically vCenter, performing the logic here, can migrate using a technique called vMotion, and it can move virtual machines from one ESXi host to another in real time. So for example, maybe it chooses to go ahead and move these three virtual machines, which are 10% each. So that's the 30% as a whole. And maybe it moves one of them over to ESXi host B and a couple of them over to ESXi host C, which would then change the utilization here to 50% if you got one more. And host C, if you got two more, would be 60% utilization. And that would drop our utilization on ESXi host A down to 70%. So now we've got a 70, 50, 60 split compared to having one at 100% utilization and barely surviving, while the other two are just saying, woohoo, life is easy, 40%, 40%. So that feature again is called DRS, Distributed Resource Scheduler, and that's just one of the benefits of having multiple ESXi hosts participate as a member of the same cluster. Here we are logged on to the vSphere web client, and we're using the vCenter server appliance that we deployed in the previous nugget. So this is the vCenter server appliance that's running as a VM on our VMware workstation. And this is the home page for the vSphere web client. The primary four components that we're going to be using over and over again are these four right here. Hosts and clusters, and that's regarding ESXi hosts and clusters, which are groups of hosts. VMs and templates, which is a fast way to create a virtual machine. Storage and networking. And we can get to those sections simply by clicking on those icons, or we have this really cool icon up here with the little house, which represents home. And if we click on that, in older versions of vSphere, the web client, it would take you to home every single time. But now when you click there in the current version of vSphere, it gives us a drop-down list where we can select many of those same items. So here we have host and clusters, VMs and templates, storage and networking. So the cool thing is we have multiple ways of navigating to the same area here inside of the vSphere web client. So for now, let's do this. Let's go ahead and click on hosts and clusters. So up here at the top, it shows us vcsa.nuglab.local. And the little arrow to the left is pointing down. That means it's expanded. It also implies that we have nothing in here. We have no folders. We have no data centers. We have no clusters. We have no ESXi hosts. And also over here to the right, it's showing us regarding resources that we have no virtual machines, no hosts, no CPU, no memory, no storage regarding our vSphere infrastructure. So we'll have to get at least one ESXi host as part of a data center before we're going to have some of these resources showing up that we can use for virtual machines inside of vSphere. And the question might come up, well, Keith, wait a second. Didn't we deploy an ESXi host, and don't we have a virtual machine on ESXi 1? And that's a great question. The answer is yes, we do. We have an ESXi host. In fact, we have two of them, and one of them, ESXi 1, has a virtual machine that we configured sitting on that ESXi host. But the challenge here is that vCenter does not yet know about that ESXi host. We have to link the two together. So what we'll do is we'll right-click here on vcsa.nuglab.local, and from the drop-down, we could create a new data center or create a new folder. And for organizational purposes and also for the administration of rights, if we want to create a folder here, we can. I'm going to name this USA, and we'll click on OK. So now I've got this USA folder as part of my vSphere environment. Now, I could also create another one for other countries as well if we were going to have data centers in those locations as well. Now, one of the requirements for bringing in an ESXi host is we have to have at least one data center object defined here in vCenter. So to do that, we'll go ahead and right-click on USA. And you'll notice from the drop-down, this is a handy thing, it's showing us actions-USA just to remind us of which object we just clicked on. So even though vcsa.nuglab.local is highlighted right here, I did my right click on USA. And that's why actions-USA is indicating that we are looking at the drop-down menu for the USA folder. If you're ever not sure, you can just go ahead and click on the object so it is highlighted, then right click on it, just for a little bit more of a comfort level that you really are configuring the object that you think you are. And then here in the USA folder, let's go ahead and create a new data center. So from the drop down, we'll select New Data Center. And let's call this Las Vegas or LV Data Center 1. In case we have more than one data center that's going to be in Las Vegas. And we'll click on OK. So to see that data center, we can expand the USA folder. And there's the Las Vegas Data Center 1 right there. And now here, inside the Las Vegas Data Center, we could tell the vCenter server that we want to bring in an ESXi host, or we could create a cluster and then put the hosts in that cluster. The cluster is optional, but there's a lot of benefits from having the cluster. Again, the ability for multiple ESXi hosts to pool their resources for features like Distributed Resource Scheduler. So here in the Las Vegas Data Center, we'll right-click once again, and we'll select from the drop-down New Cluster. And we'll call this Cluster 1. And right here, there's a whole bunch of features that we can enable at the cluster level to turn on those features. And we'll have separate nuggets as we take a look at those individual features and enable them as we continue through the course. So for now, I'm not going to enable any of these additional cluster-based features. I'm simply going to click on OK. Also, at the very bottom here, I've got a recent task list that's identifying the tasks as they happen. So the first thing we did, we created a folder, and then we created a data center, and then we created a cluster. And this little pin right over here allows us to go ahead and minimize that pane down to the bottom if we want the real estate up here to work with. So I'll go ahead and minimize that down to the bottom again. And then if we expand the Las Vegas Data Center, there's our cluster. So here, if we wanted to bring in ESXi1 and ESXi2 and put them into this cluster, it's just a matter of right-clicking on the cluster and adding those hosts. So let's do it. We'll right-click on the cluster, and from the drop-down, we'll select Add Host. So it's asking for the host name or IP address of the ESXi host that we want to bring in. Because I've got DNS that's currently working and it's tested, it's verified, I'm going to go ahead and use the host name of ESXi-1.nuglab.local. It's asking for a username that vCenter can use to initially contact and set up communications with this ESXi host. So the username that we're going to use is root, and the password is the password that we configured for that root user when we deployed the ESXi host a few nuggets ago. So having supplied the username and the password, we will click on Next. It's asking us to verify the thumbprint, and hey, I'm looking at my notes from a few nuggets ago when we looked at the SHA-1 thumbprint, and it started with 4B12 and it ended with 9B24, and that still looks like it's the case. So that indeed is ESXi host number 1. So we are going to click on Yes to confirm. And look at this. This is fantastic. It's showing us that that ESXi host has a virtual machine called vCSA. It's not currently running because we powered it down in a previous nugget, but we didn't delete it. So that's our virtual machine for the vCenter server appliance that we deployed on ESXi1 a few nuggets ago. So we'll click on Next. It's asking us about licenses. At the moment, we're using the eval license. It says we have 59 more days on that license. We'll click on Next. And now it's asking us about lockdown mode for that ESXi host. And this is a slight modification from version 5.5 and older flavors of ESXi. If we select strict, that means that this host, the ESXi host, is only accessible through the vCenter server. That's it. The direct console user interface, once we finish this wizard, if we check that radio button, it'll be disabled. If we click the radio button next to normal, we then get the direct console user interface, and we can manage it through vCenter. And the default behavior is disabled, which means we're not using lockdown mode. And we can go back and change that at a later time if we want. We're going to accept the default for now and click on Next. It gives us a little summary, and then we'll click on Finish. And what's happening is The vCenter server is now integrating an object that represents ESXi1 as part of our vSphere infrastructure, and as a result, we can use the vSphere web client communicating with the vCenter server, who will then go ahead and directly manage the ESXi host that we just added. So if we expand cluster 1, here we have ESXi1, and we just repeat that for the second ESXi host that we also have in our lab environment. And we'll click on finish. Now, check this out. Before I click on finish, I just noticed something. We've got a data store on each of these ESXi hosts that's named data store. And as a result, inside of vCenter, as part of the inventory, there's going to be two. And vCenter is not going to be too happy about them both having the same name. So what vCenter is going to do is ESXi2, because there's already a data store in there called data store, it's going to add some appendage to this to make it unique in the inventory of the vCenter server. So we'll see that as a result after we bring it in. So we'll go ahead and click on finish. And there we have ESXi-2 that is now part of our inventory as well. So if we went back up, for example, to vcsa.nuglab.local, it's now indicating that we've got some resources. We have CPU, we've got memory, we've got storage, and those are being provided by the ESXi hosts that we have as part of our infrastructure. I also just noticed, or just realized anyway, that I've got a typo here in data center. I spelled it LV-data cedar, and I, for one, do not want to have to look at that incorrectly spelled data center for the rest of our course. So I'm going to right click on this data center object, and from the drop down menu regarding that data center object, I'm going to select rename, and I'm going to add the N there. So it's LV-data center 1 and click on OK. And that looks much, much better. In this nugget, we've taken a look at some options we can use in organizing resources in vCenter, including using folders and clusters and data centers, along with how to add ESXi hosts into that infrastructure using the vSphere web client along with vCenter. And it is quiz time. Question number 1. What are the two advantages of using folders inside of vCenter? Question number 2. What's the minimum number of data center objects required inside of vCenter? And I should add, for it to be functional. And question number 3. Why do you need at least one ESXi host as an object in vCenter? And this is also a great time for you and I just to review these concepts. So for question number 1, the two advantages for folders in vCenter is number 1, organization. If you have lots of locations and lots of data centers, we can use folders, and we can use folders for organizing data centers. We also have the ability to use other folders to organize things such as virtual machines. And the second advantage, besides organization, is also that we can have that as a point to assign rights. The minimum number of data center objects is 1. We have to have one data center object before we can bring in an ESXi host. And why we need to have at least one ESXi host, that's where the compute resources are being provided. The memory and the CPU is from the ESXi hosts that are going to be the home to our virtual machines. So a vCenter environment without a single ESXi host is pretty much worthless. And if we have multiple ESXi hosts, we could put them into clusters, and we could kind of leverage the resources of all the hosts in that cluster for supporting our virtualized environment. Your action item, my friend, is to create at least one data center. I would recommend also beneath that data center creating a cluster and then adding your 2 ESXi hosts in your lab to that cluster. I appreciate you joining me for these nuggets. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.